الرحمن الرحیم. ډېرو ګرانو مشرانو، وزیر صاحبانو، ابدالی صاحب محترم، احمد صاحب محترم، صاحب محترم، داسې ګران صاحب، اولین صاحب، اډوال صاحب محترم، امین صاحب او نورو ټولو درنو دوستانو، ملګرو، احمد صاحب محترم، همچنان دوستان بسیار زیاد خوش آمدید به دومین لکچر تاریخ بنیاد تاریخ کار کرد. من میخوایم که دو کلمه در مورد بنیاد معلومات دوستان آمده باشم، خبر باشم و یک چند کلمه با معرفی خود آقای حسین، فرخ حسین، آقای فرخ حسین است و شماست. بنیاد کار کرد هدف یعنی عملا چه تاریخ برای سیرن لیکنی دی عنوان زیاتول او خلکو ته رسول او باین حال کې دا یوازې د اصلا کارکړ د کتابونو موضوع کې نه بلکې تاریخ عمومي او دې مورد کې موږ د بېلابېلو ادارو سره اوس ویلی شو چې در ولایات چند مجالس سیمینار گرفته شدن، در کابل گرفته شدن. ما همچنان پلان داریم که با کانتون‌های معتبر دنیا فعلا فکر کنم یکم وقت‌تر است که نامش بگیریم، اما ما در صحبت هستیم که شاید در لندن هم در ماه اکتبر هم سیمینارهای دیگه تا بتانیم که ریسرچرهای افغان و همچنان خارجی با آنها با تماس باشیم و گسترش کار اکادمیک در مورد تاریخ افغانستان صورت بگیریم. در این حال کوشش زیاد خواهد شد که برای جوانای ما که از شاید از علاقمندی شد تعداد بسیار زیاد است بتانیم که از طریق سوشل میدیا صرفا مختلف دیگر یعنی همین فیلم‌های کوتاه در مورد واقعات تاریخی و همچنان افراد تاریخی داشته باشیم. همچنان خوش هستیم که برای شما به اطلاعتان برسیم که 4 کتاب در این هفته که بر ما امروز رسیدن چاپ شدن. این کتابشان هستند که پشتون افغان و افغانستان و فکر کنم موضوعات بسیار قبلا چاپ شده بود اما موضوعات بسیار اساسی کشور است که می‌تونیم که این کتاب خوانده معلومات را اضافه کنیم و همچنان کتاب دیگه بسیار مهم و برای این وقت بسیار فکر می‌کنم اساس هم است که در مورد سلطنت شاه خان کتاب بسیار کوتاه و جالب است. من یک هفته پیش قربان سر 9 بار مطالعه کردم در مورد اصلاحاتشون و دلایل ناکامیشون و چی دلایلی بود فکر کنم این کتاب جالب است. و این کتاب دیگه هم بسیار زیاد فکر کنم می‌بینیم این افغانستان و کوشش افغان‌ها به خاطر ایجاد دولت در خارج یعنی همون جایی که می‌بینیم که چیش خوب نیست که حتی در سرزمینی که شاید که امروز هم سرش بحث صورت می‌گیره یعنی امپراتوری ابدالی دورانی و جای دیگه کوشش کردن که از نقشه افغانستان امروزی که در کمتر جایی که اینا کوشش کنه که حکومت بسازن و کتاب آخرشان از یک ترجمه کتاب بسیار مهم است که چه تاریخ ستوری که چه کار روی چه به هم ترجمه شده و در قبولش چه لاست را دارم بل دینا بغیر مگه فعالیتونش هم چی تو وبسایت که هر کلا از قبولش دینا خبر روزی و طول نقل خبر داده شما چه مونږ ورسره عمل شروع کړی دی خو تاسو ټول همکارۍ ته ضرورت لري چې دا پراخ وسي نو فکر کوم چې هر برخه کې تاسو کولی شئ چې همکاري وکړئ لطفا دا د چا شخصي یا فامیلي بنسټ نه دی بلکې د ټولو افغانانو بنسټ دی موږ یو وسیله شوي یاستو کولی شئ چې ونډې ونیسي یا د کتابونو ترجمې کې همکاري وکړي او نو هر یو بخش کې چې تاسو کوم نظر ولرئ وروسته موږ سره شریک کړئ او دا خپله حصه واخلئ تاسو موږ به تاسو سره کومک کوو نو بیا هم تاسو خپله بنسټ دی ډېر ښه راغلی او موږ به کوشش کوو چې دغه فعالیتونو سره کوشش کوو چې د افغانستان هغه پټې تاریخ اړخونه یې ورسره روښانه. ډېر خوشحال یم. We're extremely happy to have Farah Hussain. د فامیل د خپله په انګلستان کې پیدا شوي دي، هلته یې سبق ویلی، هلته یعنې انګلیس دی خو د خپله د افغانستان نه دي. یو جالبه دا و چې د دوی فامیل د شاه شجاع د وخت کې هغې هغه اصلاح د زیورات په شمول د کورینو دي، هغې ساتنه د دوی فامیل باندې کېدله. او دا هم راته یې وویل چې هغې هم د هغې تخلص کاکړي وو، هغه وخت یې هم کاکړانو باندې اعتبار مخال شاهانو ډېره کېدله. نو هغه هم ډېر جالبه کیسې لري، هغې مورد کې هم نو دی خپله ډېر زیات دی خپله د تاریخ لیکچرر دی، حقوق یې هم لوستي کار کوي، او دونه مهم دی او کتاب یې چې لیکلی چې تاسو ګورئ افغانستان and the age of empire دی لیکلی دی او دی یو خلک ډېر خوښ. After how many years did you come to Afghanistan?
18.
After 18 years. نو دې لپاره موږ چې د موقع استفاده وکړو، د ثبات واپس روان دي چې موږ سره خپل نظریات او شریک کړو. په آخر کې وایم چې ولې دا موضوع خوښه شوه. I think why we chose this subject. We went over different subjects. زه فکر کوم چې د افغانستان لپاره د ابدالي امپراتوري یعنې شروع موږ چې فکر کوو ګریټ افغانستان شروع یې دغه وخت نه شروع شوه، او دغه یو قرن کې بیا تر انګلو افغان اول وار دغه جنګ پورې یعنې دا چې کوم تحولات دی راغلي او د انګریزانو سره دا جنګ شروع شو، نو دغه وخت چې په افغانستان باندې فشار ډېر زیات راغی او فکر کوم چې هغه سرحدات یې ورته ډېر وتنګېدل. زه فکر کوم دا یو ډېر جالبه وخت وي چې دې مورد کې موږ تاسو وشو کړی چې عمیق معلومات تاسو. دویم تاریخ یوازې فکر کوم تاسو ټول مشانه سي ګورئ، تاریخ یوازې د تاریخ لپاره سړی نه لولي، بلکې د تاریخ لوستل حتی دغه د نن ورځې مسایلو مورد کې هم سړی ګوري چې دا فیصلې څه ترتیب کېږي، تاثیرات یې څه دي، ولې دا سیاسي اکټور یا خارجي داخلي فکټورونه څه رقم تاثیرات روزل شي د دې نتیجه څه وي. زه فکر کوم حتی اوسني حالاتو په کله چې ډېر شیان حتی موږ کولی شو چې ورته درس واخلو چې اوسني ستاسو سیاسي حالات څه ترتیب کړي.
Thank you for attending this talk. And I am grateful to the Kafir Foundation for arranging this talk on the theme of the Durani Empire. So, as Kafir Saab said, I'm a collector of art. I think one of the things that we will need to do is protect our heritage. This is one of the miniatures in my collection of Ahmad Shah Durani, which I was fortunate enough to receive. Coming on to the topic of Ahmad Shah's empire, in 1747, after the death of Nadir Shah, Ahmad Shah becomes Durani Duran, Shah Pearl of the age. The Durani Empire is a significant territory, the second largest after the Ottoman Empire. Many in the modern world forget this. The British, in comparison, were just in 3 small parts of India at this time. They were in Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, whereas the empire of the Durani stretched from Mashhad all the way down to Sirhind, beyond Amritsar. However, obviously the empire wasn't trouble-free. In 1767, the Sikhs were rising in the Punjab and seized Lahore from the Duranis. In 1772, Timur Shah becomes the leader of the Durani Empire. Unfortunately, he isn't very active. Tipu Sultan's army would fire masses of these rockets. This devastated the British army. Unfortunately, the British reversed engineered this rocket and used it against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. In 1781, the British surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown. General Cornwallis is the defeated British general who then joins the East India Company. He doesn't want to lose a second time and doesn't want to lose a territory as potentially as vast as India that can become their colony. So he begins the Third Mysore War against Tipu, and to some degree he has some success.
Who was Tipu? I'm sorry, you can give some background?
Tipu Sultan was the son of the ruler of Mysore, whose name, the father's name is mentioned in my book, and Tipu was basically a nightmare for the British. Tipu was fighting the British alone, but was allied to the French. The nearest French outpost was in Mauritius. They were sending him men and supplies. In 1798, Napoleon lands at Alexandria in Egypt, foolishly thinking that he's going to march to assist Tipu Sultan in India to defeat the British. At the same time, the Afghans also have diplomatic relations with Tipu Sultan through the port of Gwadar. Tipu sends ambassadors to Zaman Shah. So if we move on to Zaman Shah, this is a miniature of Zaman Shah which sold in the USA some years ago, just for the sum of $1,000. So you all missed out on a bargain. I curse myself as well. That is not in my collection. If only you could invent a time machine. So here we have Zaman Shah. He wants to build a centralized state. He wants a national army free from tribal influences. Up to this time, the nobles had been providing manpower in exchange for grants of territory which were free from the taxation of the ruler. Zaman Shah has Indian ambitions, and as I said, in 1797 forms an alliance with Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan writes to Zaman Shah, and he says in his letter, quote, "The supremacy of the English was the source of evil to all God's creatures." So they agreed that the Afghans will advance into India. Zaman Shah prepares his forces at Lahore in 1799, but unfortunately, the British encouraged the Persians to attack Herat. So Zaman Shah has to move his forces back to defend Afghanistan, and Tipu Sultan is defeated in the Battle of Seringapatam by Britain. In 1800, again, Zaman Shah tries to come down to Lahore with his troops. This time, the East India Company sends an embassy to the Qajar ruler and basically tells the Qajar ruler that the Duranis have been killing Shiites in Lahore, and that you should support us in preventing an Afghan advance into Lahore or beyond into India. So the Qajar ruler asks, "What do you want from me? Do you want me to send my Iranian forces into battle to wage a sectarian war?" And the British ambassador says, "No, that's not what we want you to do. That would unite the Afghans. What we want you to do is to divide the Afghans. You should fund Mahmud Shah, the stepbrother of Zaman Shah, fund him with an army of his own men, so that he can go and divide the Afghans." That's what happens. Mahmud Shah advances and takes Kandahar from Qajar Persia, and does battle with the forces of Zaman Shah between Ghazni and Kandahar, and Zaman Shah's men are defeated. Unfortunately, Zaman Shah is also captured and he is blinded. Mahmud Shah then becomes the short-lived Badshah of Afghanistan, but is replaced by the full brother of Zaman Shah, which is Shah Shuja. This is a print in the collection of a Sikh. So Shuja was the first Afghan leader who had direct contact with the British embassy. In Elphinstone's diary in the British Library, Elphinstone writes, "The king was magnificently dressed. His crown was less than a foot high. It was nicely set with diamonds and other jewels. He's a stout, good-looking man, about 30, with a thick black beard. He has a good-natured face, which would be much above the common level, were it not degraded by a vulgar nose." In the Elphinstone book, he doesn't mention the bumper nose and just says he's a good-looking man. But in his diary, unfortunately, he's more honest. In Shuja's Baqiyat, he doesn't mention whether the British, what he thought of the British or their noses. So if we move on, Shuja's rule, unfortunately, lasts only slightly longer than the Elphinstone mission, and Mahmud Shah returns to power after defeating Shuja's army in London. Shuja now begins his wanderings in the Punjab and is eventually detained by Ranjit Singh. He is detained in this building in Lahore. This is basically a large green gateway. It's probably about 30 foot high. It's large enough for an elephant to go in with a rider on top. And inside it has traditional courtyards. Now, Shuja is detained here. The Sikhs know that he has the Koh-i-Noor amongst other diamonds, and they basically try and encourage him to give them the diamonds through depriving him of food, and also placing him in the cage. So when Ranjit Singh goes out and travels, he takes Shah Shuja as though he's an animal in a cage with him. In addition, multiple guards are placed over Shah Shuja. It's at this time that Shuja and his followers decide to make a hole in Shuja's bedroom floor, and gradually they descend into the basement of this building called the Mubarak Mansion. They then make a hole through to the drains of Lahore and Shuja exits via the drain with two of his followers. They are all dressed as Hindu fakirs. We move on to the next slide. This is Ranjit Singh, who I described in my book as a Dajjal-like emperor. So initially he's ruling in the Punjab, he takes Kashmir, he seizes Multan, and eventually Peshawar. So Shuja has to determine to leave this man. He flees, but he ends up with the East India Company in Ludhiana, where the forward post of the East India Company is based. And it's at this time that he begins his writings about homesickness. No refugee enjoys a life of financial handouts, and everyone loves their own country. One of Shuja's poems, which my father translated from Durani, reads, "I wish to hear from those sweet lips. I wish to have sugar and sweet from that mouth. My heart has burnt from the heat of Hindustan. My heart yearns for the climate of my home." There's more poetry translated in my book, and we now come to the Yusufzai, because in 1834, Shah Shuja and Ranjit Singh agree that Ranjit Singh will seize Peshawar and keep it. In return, Ranjit Singh will help Shuja capture Kabul. Now, Ranjit obviously seizes Peshawar, captures it, but Kandahar is an unsuccessful mission for Shah Shuja. And Shah Shuja obviously is considered to be unlucky in Afghan history. The legacy is that Peshawar is lost to the Afghans, and this is a rare miniature of a Pashtun woman from the Yusufzai tribe and a Pashtun man. And again, one in my collection. But Shuja's wife was a Yusufzai. The other concern of the British was if this army advances towards India, the people in the bazaars of India would be discussing the moves of what they would perceive as a liberation army and would rise up against the British masters and overthrow them. For this reason, the tripartite agreement between the Sikhs, the British, and Shuja is entered into. The agreement is basically to place Shuja on the throne of Kabul, but Shuja objects. Shah Shuja states that he will not be happy going to Kabul with British Army. He needs to be sent with his own troops, otherwise the people will never accept him and they will consider him to be a kafir. But the British ignore Shuja and they advance towards Afghanistan through Balochistan, because the Sikhs do not want the British to advance directly through the Punjab because they're scared the British might occupy them. So they say that you can attack Afghanistan but not through our territories. So for this reason, the British have to advance through Sindh and Balochistan. The problem with Balochistan is obviously the men are armed. This is an illustration by a British officer from the First Anglo-Afghan War of Balochis in the Bolan Pass, ambushing the British caravans. The other problem with Balochistan is that there's been a drought for 3 years. Now the British Army didn't travel with food supplies or water. So there's a lack of water, there's a lack of food, and the British are also having to fight their way forwards. Now this is a watercolor produced by a British officer in my collection of the advance through the Khojak Pass. Further, a watercolor of the same pass. You can see the steep cliffs, ideal ambush territory, and the Balochis are liberating the camels and supplies from the British. Now, the British are in a very difficult situation due to the lack of water. Some of them are dying of thirst. The same with the Indians. One British officer writes that he was having a shave, and in front of him was a bowl with some water. He was dipping his razor in it, and his English servant rushes forward into his tent and says, "Please let me have that water." And before he could answer, the servant takes the bowl and drinks it. And the officer said, "He's drinking it like it was champagne." But obviously, for some of these people, the lesser mortals, the servants and the Indians, they weren't getting their supply of water. Now, another officer says, "Our horses could barely run. We weren't in a position to fight." So what the British decide to do is unfortunately bribe this man. He is Haji Qatar Khan, one of the nobles, you could call him, serving the Barakzai Sardars of Kandahar, and he is supposed to assist in a night raid on the British camp. They change sides, and many of the other power backers behind the Barakzai Sardars also change sides, and the result is that the British are able to advance into. So the British advance into Kandahar. This is an interesting illustration of Kandahar. You've got two Durani nobles in their traditional clothing, and you can see the kind of traditional architecture as well at Kandahar at that time. So in Kandahar, the British are able to eat, they're able to refresh themselves, they enjoy the kebabs in the bazaar, they enjoy the hammam, and they see the sights. This is a photo from the Second Anglo-Afghan War of Ahmad Shah's tomb. And 1879-80. It's not clear when the photos were taken.
Yeah. Irish photographer.
Yeah. This is by a man named Benjamin Simpson, who was a surgeon. Here we have the first photo ever taken of a Afghan woman in Kandahar. You can see on what would be the left side of her face from where you're sitting, there's what seems like a tear mark down her face. My interpretation is that the British have forced her to remove her veil and taken her photograph. And she's not happy that she's having to be photographed by the occupiers of her city. Now, one of the early accounts of the activities of the British in Kandahar was by an Indian writer who was working under Amir Habibullah. He wrote a book called A Brief Political History of Afghanistan, and in that book he writes, while the army was encamping at Kandahar, The rapist on the march to Kandahar was amongst the troops that were reduced to eating seeds from the excrement of animals. And now they were preying on virtuous women. But obviously Afghanistan is Afghanistan, and sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Two British officers decide to go fishing on the Araganda River, and they are attacked by some Afghan men. One officer is killed, his horse and kit are captured by the Afghans. If we move on now, the scene of warfare changes and the British advance on to Ghazni. Now here you can see the city and citadel of Ghazni. The citadel is the Bala Hisar, and even the city in those days was surrounded by a wall. Around the wall was a moat. The citadel had 4,000 hand-picked men in, under Ghulam Hyder Khan, the son of Dost Muhammad Khan. In addition, Muhammad Afzal Khan, the father of Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, was commanding the Afghan cavalry. They were 5,000 strong. The British troops were less than the combined Afghan forces, probably in the region of 5,000 to 6,000 men. Unfortunately, the Afghan side is betrayed to some degree by the ambitions of Ghulam Hyder Khan. Muhammad Afzal Khan asks Ghulam Hyder Khan, let me and my men into the city. We will then come out from time to time to attack and destroy the British forces. Ghulam Hyder Khan thinks that he's in a very strong position behind these double walls, the city walls and the walls of the citadel, that there's no way the British can defeat him. So he refuses to let Muhammad Afzal Khan's men into Ghazni. So Muhammad Afzal Khan abandons his intention to attack the British and moves his forces away. So now the only opponent the British have is Ghulam Hyder Khan, locked up in Ghazni. The British are informed by a traitor that all the gates of the city are blocked up apart from the Kabul gate. So they blow open the Kabul gate and rush forward at night to attack the city. So here we see the British advancing into towards the Kabul gate under fire from the defenders of Ghazni. They've advanced through the Kabul gate and inside the city. So above the arch we have the Afghan defenders. They're throwing rocks onto the British. The British at that time had a helmet. The helmet wasn't the modern steel or metal helmet, but was made of thick leather. One British soldier is hit on the head, his helmet is crushed, and he rushes out of Ghazni saying that his head really hurts. So the officer takes his hat off. Underneath he finds a big fat chapati. The chapati has saved the life of this English soldier, which the English soldier had hoped to eat at a favourable opportunity. The British advance further into Ghazni city. They met with a mass of Afghan defenders who are determined to beat the British back, but they're only armed with swords and shields. So the British open fire on the Afghans and basically shoot them down, and they advance towards the citadel doors. Now, unfortunately, the citadel doors have been left open by Ghulam Hyder Khan. He's deserted the citadel of Ghazni and is concealed in one of the outer walls of outer tower walls inside Ghazni city, hoping to escape when the battle dies down. Here we have Ghulam Hyder Khan. He's described as an immensely fat man. We can't see this because he's wearing these colorful robes. And there's a battle at the citadel. The Afghans are there. There's a chieftain who is wearing a luxurious costume. He has jewels on, diamonds. And this is the first time from a British source that we read of the role of an Afghan woman in hand-to-hand combat against the British. And it's not the last instant that happens. Ghulam Hyder Khan's captured, the city falls. Unfortunately, all the belongings of the people are sold by the British in an auction. So there was a jeweler amongst the British troops. He tells his officer, look at that metal shield. You have to buy it, whatever money it costs. The officer buys it for 20 rupees and finds that it's made of the finest white gold and is worth about £400. In addition, the amount of money that's accumulated from the auction is distributed amongst the soldiers according to rank. So Major General William Knott receives the sum of £378. Many of the British writers claim that Warburton is an honourable man because he's married this lady. What actually happens, according to the Warburton family sources, is that Robert Warburton bribes the servants in the household of this Afghan lady, Jahandar Begum, and they inform Jahandar Begum that there's a message from your husband. It's a secret message, and you need to go to the house of a certain person to read this message. So they take this lady in a palanquin along with her 12-year-old son, and they abandon her in a room in this house. She draws the curtains of the palanquin, and in front of her she finds Robert Warburton pointing his pistol at her, saying, your husband will believe you have eloped with me, and he will divorce you. You're going to have to live here with me. I will marry you. She was considered to be the most beautiful woman in Kabul, and this is why Warburton turns his attentions towards her. So the British were enjoying Afghanistan, but they were skating on thin ice, and they were actually skating as well on the moat of the Bala Hisar. However, McNaughton in the winter of 1839-1840 is in Jalalabad with Shah Shuja, and he is basically deciding to have a coup against Shah Shuja's government. He deposes Mullah Shakur, in part because Mullah Shakur has tried to maintain the independence of the Afghan state under Shah Shuja by trying to have freezes on essential prices, as well as telling the imams that the khutbah cannot be read in Shuja's name because Shuja's state has been taken over by the British. So Mullah Shakur is deprived of the viziership and later executed by McNaughton. McNaughton is presented with 12 slave girls in Jalalabad by Shah Shuja, and Lady McNaughton learns about this from a British officer. So the British officer comes to Lady McNaughton, and he asks her, have you heard about the presents that McNaughton has been presented with? And she says, come, tell me, man, what has he been presented with? Has he been given some nice diamonds or some lovely animal furs? Stupid man, he knows how much I like these, but he hasn't mentioned anything about that. And the officer's slightly embarrassed, says, no, that's not quite what he's received as presents. And he tells her he's been given 12 slave girls, but he's only kept 8. And she's hysterical, and she decides to move to Afghanistan, and all the other British women whose husbands are in Afghanistan also decide to follow their husbands because they're worried that they might be abandoned in favor of Afghan women. The scene moves on to battle, eventually. The first battle is the Battle of Perwan Dara. Dost Muhammad is with some cavalry in the Perwan Valley, and he's faced by 3 squadrons of the Bengal light cavalry. The British officers order their Indian men on cavalry to attack. The British officers move forwards, but unbeknown to them, they don't look back. The Indians haven't bothered to advance. So Dost Muhammad managed to kill all the British officers at the Battle of Perwan Dara, and later the British investigate why is it that our Indian troops did not advance. The Indians say that the reason is that the Afghan sword is much stronger than the British sword, and that when the Afghan shamshir hits the British sword breaks. Later, when Dost Muhammad surrenders shortly thereafter after this battle to the British, he confirms in Calcutta to Emily Eden, the Governor General's sister, that the British officers were brave, but their weapons were like straws. The situation is changing. Shuja is not happy with the British remaining in Kabul. The deal with McNaughton is that the British would have left Kabul after placing Shuja on the throne. Within the tripartite agreement, there was no scope for any interactions between Afghan civilians and British troops. McNaughton had broken the agreement with Shuja. So Shuja encourages the Duranis to rise up around Kandahar against the British. The Harati Sagarzais also assist. And the British have a hard battle in Kandahar and Helmand. And eventually there's just one chieftain who's still resisting, which is Akram Khan. He's seized in a night raid, taken to Kandahar, and they blow him from a cannon. But McNaughton fails to understand Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. And so in James Rattray's book, he writes that in May 1842, the widow of Akram Khan comes leading the Afghan forces in battle against the British at Kandahar. She's sitting on her husband's horse. She's holding his tribal flag and leading the men on the attack at Kandahar. Unfortunately, the attack is unsuccessful because the British use artillery fire, which fires not just a cannon shell but shrapnel against the Afghan cavalry. So the Afghan cavalry is pushed back. McNaughton now makes another mistake. He had agreed with the Ghilzi to make payments to them in order to keep the road to India open for communications. McNaughton stops the payments to the Ghilzi. The Ghilzi stop the communication between the British in Kabul and India. General Sale is sent from Kabul to open the road so that the communications can be secured. Unfortunately, General Sale, he basically goes to Jalalabad and fails to open the road between Jalalabad and Kabul. Elphinstone orders General Sale to return to Kabul. General Sale refuses to obey orders and tells Elphinstone, if I return, my force will be wiped out by the Ghilzi. Shuja's death is predicted by a fortune teller, and McNaughton and Burns are deciding on appointing Timur, who is Shah Shuja's son, as the successor. This is in September 1841, but unbeknown to Burns and McNaughton, Shuja will outlive both of them. The further fatal mistake McNaughton makes is to order the pro-Shuja nobles into exile. So there are exile orders for Abdullah Khan Achakzai, Ghulam Muhammad Khan Bamizai, Abdul Salam Khan and Abdullah Khan Logari. They're given just 3 days to leave Afghanistan and not return. They are told that they cannot reside in Peshawar they must go into India. So there's a book which was written by Muhammad Hassan Shark, who I understand was a minister in the Najib government. And he writes in his book that these nobles, they came to the king and they said to him, look, how are we supposed to leave all our worldly belongings, our families, our houses, and go to India? Shuja, Shark says, stepped down from the throne and took a lower seat. He untied the emerald-studded golden sword of his ancestor, Ahmad Shah Baba, and held that in both hands to offer with a sense of disgrace to the Mujahideen. With tears of shame rolling down on his cheeks, he said that the sword of Ahmad Shah Baba was meant for the defense of the independence of Afghanistan and support to Islam. I do not deserve to fasten it around my waist. The sword looks nice around the waist of a brave freedom lover who fights against the invaders of his country. These nobles were being invited by Shuja to fight not only for their own rights, but for the rights of their people and for independence from the occupation. Burns was to be Macnaghten's successor, and Macnaghten was due to leave for India and become a Governor General of one of the three presidencies. However, the Afghans decide to strike Burns, and the first target of the Kabul uprising is Burns's house. Now, you've all heard of the Kabul uprising. It occurs, according to the British, on the 2nd of November, 1841. And many writers say it was in Ramadan. So what I did was identify what date in Ramadan this was. It was the 17th of Ramadan. Now, the significance of the 17th of Ramadan is it's the anniversary of the Battle of Badr. So to get blessings and perhaps greater reward from Allah, to fight in his cause, the uprising occurs on this date. In the Puli Kishti Mosque, the call to jihad is given by Mirwais Haji Masoon, who apparently was known as Hafizji. Other mosques also proclaim the call to jihad after the Fajr prayers. And Burns is killed along with his brother and another officer named Broadfoot. The situation becomes more grave for the British. At the Battle of Bimaru, the Afghans take their cannons to the top of Bimaru, and the white buildings in the center of the picture are the old British cantonment. So they start opening fire on the cantonments. Now, the British decide to advance forwards very reluctantly. They form squares, and he decides to use the snipers to pick off the British troops one by one. The Afghan Juzel had a range of 800 yards. The British Brown best weapon at that time had a range of only 400 yards. So the British had no response in terms of firepower against the Afghan weaponry. This was at a time when the British had their industrial revolution, yet the weapons of the Afghan artisans were far superior to the British. The Afghan sword was superior, the Afghan Juzel was superior, and in the command of Abdullah Khan Achakzai, the British were defeated. And sadly, Abdullah Khan Achakzai becomes a shaheed in this battle. The British are forced back into the cantonments, and the only thing left for the British is to negotiate with the Afghans. Muhammad Akbar Khan now arrives in Kabul, and Muhammad Akbar Khan gives the British 3 days to leave Afghanistan. This is exactly the time period that Macnaghten had given to the British. Macnaghten instead initially agrees and then tries to negotiate behind the scenes with Muhammad Akbar Khan. he says, allow us to remain here until next spring 1842, and you can be the vizier to Shah Shuja, and when your father returns from exile to India, he can be the vizier. But this was the offer MacNaughton had rejected when it was presented to him in Ghazni. So it was unacceptable to Muhammad Akbar Khan. But Muhammad Akbar Khan decides to play along with MacNaughton, and I was fortunate enough to find a letter translated by the British from Persian, written in the words of Muhammad Akbar Khan. And he writes, "This faithless tribe, the English, make an agreement with us, the people of Islam, and we after deep consideration assented unanimously to the agreement that their lives should be spared, and that they should evacuate the forts, and that they should proceed in safety with their families to the frontiers of Afghanistan. But as they had treachery in their hearts, and as they were all united in the resolution to turn us, and even the entire of the tribes of the faithful, they outwardly affected cordiality towards us, while their real intention was to collect grain and to spread disunion among the people of Islam." One of the other things MacNaughton requested from Muhammad Akbar Khan as part of the agreement for him to become vizier was to hand over Aminullah Khan Nagari and some of the other nobles who had risen up against the British so that they could be executed. Now, Muhammad Akbar Khan decides to invite MacNaughton to a meeting just outside the cantonments, and at the meeting, Muhammad Akbar Khan brings the various supporters on his side, including some of the nobles, and MacNaughton basically is told that all these men at the meeting are aware of the discussions between Muhammad Akbar Khan and MacNaughton, so he can openly tell them what is in his mind. So MacNaughton reveals his double dealing. Muhammad Akbar Khan orders his men to grab 4 British officers with MacNaughton and tries to seize MacNaughton. MacNaughton has in his walking stick a sword, which he pulls out, and he shouts out, "Azbarai Khoda," and tries to fight with Muhammad Akbar Khan. But Muhammad Akbar Khan doesn't bother with the sword fight. He's been given 2 nice pistols by MacNaughton, and he puts them to good use. And
Excuse me, but he called in Pashto, and his cousin Sardar Sultan Ahmad Khan, the Caucasus, the Lord Sarai maybe that.
okay, good.
One of the
So here is an illustration by an Afghan artist of the death of MacNaughton. MacNaughton's killed with a pistol. He's cried out for God's sake. God doesn't answer his call, but an Indian called Ram rushes in to save his white master. But Ram is also killed by the Afghans. Now slowly the Indians begin to learn that there's no point fighting for the British. Kipling talked of the white man's burden. In my book I talk about the brown man's burden. The brown man's burden was to die trying to save the English. Increasingly, the Gurkhas and the other Indian troops, including the Sikhs, begin to defect to the Afghan side. And in fact, in Muhammad Akbar Khan's forces, there's a Sikh who is engaged in psychological war against the Indian troops in the cantonments to encourage them to come over to the Afghan side. In addition, it's not only Indians who are defecting. According to Lady Sell, there's a Mr. Tierney who is believed to be collaborating with the Afghan side, translating messages from the British in Latin, French, and British into Persian or Pashto for the Afghans to understand what is going on. Now, this is a man who's left his Queen Victoria and his country in favor of Allah and the Quran. The British are then forced to retreat. They're ambushed along the way because the condition of free passage was for them to give up all their weapons, which they never do. So due to this, they didn't have free passage. This is a painting of Muhammad Akbar Khan. A similar one is in the National Army Museum in Chelsea. This is one in my collection. The more traditional image of Muhammad Akbar Khan is this, which is from a painting by Vincent Eyre of what's called the Kabul prisoners. So we see Muhammad Akbar Khan dressed as a warrior with his steel helmet, a shield on his back. During the retreat, Muhammad Akbar Khan is concerned about the British officers' wives and the British officers, and he encourages them to surrender. They do so, including Lady Sale, Lady Norton. 12 British officers desert their men at Jagdalak. On horseback they flee. The British soldiers are firing to shoot them down. Only one manages to make it out of these 12 to Jalalabad, which is, as you all know, Dr. Bryden. He arrives on the 13th, which according to the British is an unlucky day. But this wasn't the only English who survived on the retreat. There was one British sergeant named Edwards who escapes from Gandamak and travels all the way through Balochistan, Sindh, and eventually ends up in Gujarat, where he identifies himself as a Briton at a military camp. But he's no longer a white-skinned man, he's a black-skinned man. He's no longer a proud redcoat. He's become an Indian fakir. He's been begging from the villages along the route. He said the Afghan villagers would feed him, but when he arrived in Sindh, the Sindhis didn't like the English because the English were just taking their country over, and so the Sindhis would set their dogs on them. So this man illustrated the very real destruction of British power to the Indians, since the proud, stiff, upper-lipped British man had become a black fakir. If we move on, Muhammad Akbar Khan had besieged Jalalabad. The siege doesn't work, but one of the other interesting things from the retreat is this painting, which is in the National Army Museum, Chelsea. It shows a British redcoat with a gun running alongside an Afghan Sardar on horseback with a dog. I presume they're going hunting. Now, General Roberts saw this in 1880 in the Bala Hissar. He was outraged that this was humiliating the British. So what he did was reverses the painting, has an artist paint a British officer on the horse and an Afghan running alongside. But what had happened during the retreat was that the British and Indians were captured. They were sold in the bazaars of Kabul for 1 rupee or 2 rupees. When the British arrived, they used to boast about how many peaches they could buy for 1 rupee. And now they themselves are being sold for 1 rupee. Time is pressing, so the story will need to be slightly curtailed. These are standards which were seized by General Sale, tribal standards which are still in Britain at the Somerset Military Museum and are not on public display. So this is a valuable Afghan artifact, including the painting which I had shown previously, that deserve to come back to their home country. Now the British send an army of revenge to attack the Afghans, and they engage in mass rape, mass destruction of villages, cities and towns, including Kabul, Charikar, Istalif, and many nameless villages, some of whom I have identified in my book. Istalif, for example, two British soldiers find a beautiful Afghan woman, and they're disputing who will possess her, and they toss a coin for who will retain her. The question for wider history is who won the first Anglo-Afghan War. That's answered by the British General Napier, who ceases Sindh. And he says that basically the Afghans will say that they wiped out one British army and forced Pollock and Nott's armies to retreat. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.